global political economy. In the course, what we're looking at is we're getting an introduction into a radical revolutionary political economy. And so with the textbook, Global Political Economy, the chapters that we want to look at is the chapters that deal with forging of a world economy from 1400 to 1800, industry, empire, and war from 1800 to 1945, and growing a global economy from 1945 to 2015, well, 2023. And the reason we want to look at this is because we want to locate ourselves in historical time. We want to know exactly what we're dealing with. We don't want to approach political economy with a number of unstated assumptions. We want to center ourselves as a global African people into the discussion. And in order to do that, we really need to go back and look at the history of the system that we have. What has happened far too many times in terms of political economy, economics, economic development with global African people is we start off automatically taking a number of assumptions about the current system for granted. And so when we, for example, when we say something like economic development, we automatically start in any of the neocolonial nation states. We start automatically from the nation state itself, the neo-colony, taking the neo-colony as a given, and then we pursue economic growth targets in a growth economy. So basically all that we've done is we're continuing the economic system of the colonial era now in the neocolonial era. And we're wondering when there are the problems that occur where we don't get the results that we want, well, why is this the case? Then if we choose to look out and say that there are commonalities rather, say with other global South nations, and we look to Asia, then we turn and we're looking at so-called successful examples in Asia, the South Asian countries, for example, which are also growth economies. And we try to look at there and say, okay, Singapore, for example, being used as a model economy of economic development. And you have a number of African countries whose ministers of finance are utilizing that as an example. Singapore as an example of a successful economy. South Korea as an example of successful economic development. And some of the other Asian nations that are held up as good examples of whatever it is that the neo-colonies think that they're attempting to do. But we do that because we have so many unstated assumptions. If we really deconstructed the system of global political economy that we're a part of, if we really deconstructed it, we should come to the conclusion that it's not in our best interest just by looking at how it came into being. It's not as if we were economically adrift prior to the forging of the contemporary global economy. So now, when we look at it, say, forging a world economy in chapter 3, and it says from 1400 to 1800. Well, what's interesting is he starts with a number of questions. The first question, why do we inhabit a world where there are such great inequalities of wealth and life chances between regions? The second question, why do some countries seem to be caught in a trap of producing products whose value declines over time, such as sugar or coffee? Third question, What accounts for the racial hierarchies in countries such as the United States and the Republic of South Africa? Fourth question, why do some societies and countries seem suspicious of the foreign and economic policies of Western states, corporations, and civic associations? Now, those questions are very important questions, but that's not where the current neo-colonies begin the discussion. If you're on the African continent, most countries outside of, say, the Southern African countries, where you have a large presence of Europeans or whites, and outside of the Northern African countries, where you have a large presence or you have a significant presence, say, of Arabs, where it's pretty obvious that there is a racial hierarchy. The rest of Africa, you would swear that they think that there just is no racial issue whatsoever, because within their countries where they've come up, they're saying, well, they didn't experience this. The whites that they have come in contact with in this neo-colonial era are normally members of non-governmental organizations. They're a part of the church, different church organizations. And so since we are a religious people, they're looking at these people who are here, and they're actually stating that they're here for a purpose other than what Europeans originally came to the continent for. But in the discussion of political economy and discussion of economic development, we don't start from these questions. You know, now there are great inequalities of wealth and life chances between, say, global South nations, such as those here on the African continent and in the West. Well, another question we could ask is, has it always been that way? And the answer to that question would be no, it has not always been that way. But we really don't ask that question in that fashion. Well, for one reason, we can look at the lecturers in the universities, the professors, you know, who spend so much of their time engaged in doing research. And you look at what actually takes place in the universities here, what's actually going on. There was a professor that I worked with some years ago, and they were from Denmark. And in the country where we were, they made the comment, they were like, how is it that the people who ran the universities in that country, who were running the university, could actually mouth that their students were being prepared to compete in the global economy? And she went on to say that in the Western countries, when students were leaving the universities, they would at least have books that they could return to if they wanted. Those students who chose not to sell the books back, which is the case in the United States, where, you know, you go and resell your textbooks or whatnot. Right now, they even rent textbooks or whatever. But, you know, you conceivably could leave those universities and you would have a mini library of sorts of books that you collected over your 4 years of matriculation at University A, whether it was a predominantly white institution or whether it was a historically Black college and university within the United States, for example. But what goes on the continent is you'll actually have classes, the majority of your classes, you have your undergraduates in, well, everything is heavily lecture oriented. And then after the lecture is done, you know, students have taken some notes of the lectures. And ever so often, professors will make photocopies of some information and hand it to students. But for the most part, the photocopies that students are getting is generally going to be stuff that they're going to be tested on. And so what you end up having is that rote memorization system in place where the students, they're going to a class, regardless of the subject, The professor is going to lecture on different topics. And then the students will occasionally receive some handouts for small assignments that they're supposed to do. And these are the universities. And then when it's time for whatever test, the professor will give lists of questions, and the students will then take the questions and they'll go to the libraries and they will seek the answer, find answers for these questions using different books. And then they'll study or memorize the answers for these questions. They'll come back and they'll take some, that's just a rough general idea of what's going on in the universities. And so you're going to get these people who are popping out of these universities, they're graduating, and that's the basis of their preparation. This is I'm being highly critical of it. I've watched it, I've experienced it, and I fought against it in some places, which has led to my abrupt departure. But how are they going to ask the correct questions when in most cases, they don't even get the quality information? They don't even have something as simple as having that information and having the mindset where you're going to sit down and you're going to engage in it. All right, you have a question?
You actually you answered a question that I had that I never proposed to you, which was, what do I do with the material? And I'm glad you touched on your past experience with the university, because unfortunately, I was thinking the same way. Like, I got the material, I read over everything. Do I take a quiz? And I think I actually asked you, like, do I need to have a quiz, or is there anything that you want me to show that I have an understanding of? And that's that type of programming, I guess, that we're used to from kindergarten all the way up to university, where you get the information, you study over it, you read over it, and then you're prepared to answer questions based on what's presented to you. And that doesn't allow for any type of critical thinking or even questioning. It's just, well, did I get the questions right? Did I answer the question? Did I answer it? So yeah, I don't think you even responded to that when I sent that message to you through the chat. Was there like a quiz or anything that I needed to focus on? Because I felt like I wasn't doing enough, but now you've explained it. So I appreciate you going through and explaining that, and it makes great sense. This is where actual learning begins.
One second, because you mentioned what you were saying, and I have this book I want to pull off the shelf real quick. The book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. I was introduced to this book maybe about 15, 20 years ago. The book was written in 1969 by Neil Postman and Charles Weingartner. And as I said, the title is Teaching as a Subversive Activity. The idea here is you're talking about inquiry-based teaching of sorts. But when they start the curriculum, when they start how you're going to approach a class, what they were stating was that it doesn't begin the way we now have these courses set up, where you have, where it's the teacher, the professor is giving all these lessons, and then we're going to test you. That's not where they begin with it, because that wouldn't, as far as they're concerned, that wouldn't be learning. That would just be more of the same. It actually starts with the student themselves and what are the student's interests? What does that person, why is that person here? What is it that they want to learn? What has motivated them in terms of this course to be in here? What has moved them to the point that they want to know more about it? And so what they recommended is that you look at what I call questions on the social system foundation of whatever the subject matter is. And so we're dealing with global political economy, which means we're dealing with public policy, which means we're dealing with economics. And the first question would be, what concerns you the most? What are the causes of your concerns? Can any of your concerns be eliminated, and how? And so they give a series of questions that you approach that are going to define how you go about dealing and interacting with that information. So at this course, I have provided digital soft copies of something like maybe 10 different books, and they're all related to the overall subject matter. Well, as opposed to doing quizzes and whatnot, the idea is that we use, in reality, a form of what I like to call the Kemetic method, but most people are familiar with it as the Socratic method. And if we've read the dialogues, you've read the dialogues of Socrates, Plato's writings on Socrates, what you're going to note is that whenever Socrates is beginning to teach, he starts with the asking of questions. When I taught secondary education and I'm teaching world geography, well, I never came in and say, today we're going to study this. If the chapter of the textbook was something, or if the district had some lesson, I would turn it into a question and would come in and ask the students a series of questions. And then I would let them go and pose answers. And the most I would do is just to, kind of guide or move, if they were getting too far away from the subject matter, the subject matter that their question focused on, not the subject matter of the class. Because they can pose a question and it would take something that would seem to be far away from geography. And the idea with all of this information is that I say, okay, we start looking at this. I'm just guiding. So I say, okay, you start here. So it's the turning point. We start with 4 or 5 chapters from the turning point. And then as you read those chapters, it's obviously going to cause things to go on inside the mind. And then, we move from those 2 chapters of the turning point, and then we go and we look at chapters on global political economy. And once again, we're starting with questions. This particular book I'm using, they start with a series of questions, but that's just the author's questions, because you yourself have your own questions of things that concern you about the subject under discussion. And Neil Postman and Weingartner, what they're saying and teaching as a subversive activity, what happens is, with this methodology of instruction, the entire system of life comes into question. And you begin to then turn the lens on power structures in society. And why is that a power structure in society? Who constructed this? Who put this together? How is this, which is a social fact for us, how is this impacting us? How is it helping us? How is it hindering us? But all of these things come into the discussion, or come into our purview, are brought into discussion, which is also why we're dealing with the systems. By using the turning point, it's taking us into the systems approach, where now the systems approach being multidisciplinary, so now it's a very wide open. We're looking at this sociologically, historically, politically, economically, psychologically, looking at the psychodynamics, looking at the psychopolitical dynamics. But we're doing all of this. And so what you get from all of this, as far as when you're taking a course, what the student gets from it is going to be based on what was of concern to that student. So that's what that's pretty much the methodology. We don't want to we're going to come in and we're going to memorize some things. No. And so what we're doing now, in terms of global political economy. We're looking at the world economy and how it was formed. From 1400 to 1800, something was put in place of something that had already been there in different countries in the global south, what I'm talking about. In Europe at this time, my wife and I have been watching documentaries on the UK, for example, well, the UK and France. And you look at the bloody, bloody imperial history of the Plantagenets and the rest of the royal houses of the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. And it's one long history of imperial wars of conquest, and they're fighting each other and slaughtering. And the system of economics that really comes out of that is an imperial economics. It's an economics of extraction. We as African people can look at the Black people of Kemet. We can go back to there and we look at Yehuti Mose. After Hatshepsut transitions and then he takes over the kingdom, he's leading his armies. He was already the head of the army. She had made him the head of the army. So he's leading the armies in conquest and pacification campaigns into what today is called Southwest Asia or the Arabian Peninsula, and then further afield into Mesopotamia and whatnot. In the temples in Quaashie, if you go there today and you look at these temples, and you go to some of the museums to see some of the texts, he leaves detailed accounts of what took place while he was there. So he goes here and he gives you a breakdown on the tribute and taxes that they collected from these people that had been conquered and that were brought back into the treasury at Quaashie in Upper Kemet. That's imperial economics. So now the economic system of Kemet was not an imperial-based system of economics because the domestic economy was centered on self-sufficient, autarkic homesteads. So the food sovereignty, for example, was in the hands of the people. Even if you go, whether or not one accepts the biblical text as history or as allegory, however, if you choose to look at the texts surrounding the texts that deal with the story of Joseph and his brothers and their movement into Kemet. Well, if you look at that story in detail, you can see that the story is written and taking place, is written as having taken place during the Hyksos invasion. And one of and this famine comes, they had 7 years of plenty, and then there's a famine. So food was already stockpiled in the storage cities around the country. So that was handed out to people. But then the Hyksos, being imperialists, at a certain point, they tell the people that, okay, if you want to receive more from here, well, you're going, before they were paying in gold, apparently, according to the story. But then afterwards, you see they start to saying, okay, well, you've got to hand over title to your land. So what you're seeing, even in that story, is that they saw that the economic system was autarkic, and so the Hyksos were seeking to gain control of the land. So they sought to undermine that autarkic system of self-sufficiency. And the best time that they could do that is when there was some type of natural disaster occurring. With Yehuti Mose, what we have here is an imperial economics. He's gone into these lands. Now, obviously, the conquest was the result of the fact that there had been the Hyksos or the Canaanite conquest into Kemet. And so the foreign policy of the nation now after liberation was, this is not going to happen again. So they took an aggressive foreign policy and started to bringing all of those places from the way of Horus all the way over into Mesopotamia all of the places in between there, bringing that as much as possible under the control of Kemet. And in the process of doing that, they laid down tribute and taxes and whatnot. And so you started to extracting the wealth from these places and bringing it into Kemet. And that wealth became a key component of the wealth, let's say, of the elites of the kingdom. All right, anyway, but it's still an imperial economics. So now when we look at the global economic system that the Europeans forged between 1400 and 1800, well, if you look between 1400 and 1600, they are laying the groundwork for this system there in Europe with the constant struggles with one another for hegemony. And the system of economics is not some natural organic system of economics. It's a system of economics of conquest. And when we look at the questions that we asked of why are there such great inequalities of wealth and life chances between regions, conquest becomes a very clear early indicator of what's going to happen after that. Someone can't come in and conquer a people and then after 600 years of conquest and domination, think that people are going to be wealthy. Well, no, it's not going to be the case. Because in order for the conqueror to maintain himself, well, they're going to start training people amongst the conquered to support the system that they have imposed upon these people. So you're going to have great inequalities of wealth and life chances when you have conquest, and then when you flip the system. Because when we're just using Africa as our focus, when Europeans came here on the African continent, we maintained a system of autarkic, self-sufficient homesteads. It didn't end when Kemet failed. That's the economic system that we utilize, a subsistence economic system. That's what we put in place. That's what we maintain. And so that was replaced by the Europeans. It took them a long time to replace it. You can read some of the reports of the colonial administrators of the colonies in French West Africa and in the British controlled colonies in East and West Africa. You can read the reports, and they were sending in academics first off to study the people because they wanted to find out how to better incorporate the people into the imperialist system. Because what was going on was, well, people still had their own small farms, their own way of life. They were not a part of the world economy. They were growing their own food. They were making their own clothing. They were providing themselves with their own shelters. Europeans had to move people off of that system and bring them into the world economy so they could further extract wealth from these folks in the form of labor in this case, and by taking over the land once they're able to gradually or to remove the people from the land. Since you didn't have wholesale settler colonialism, say on the African continent. That wasn't the case in the United States when the Europeans went there. They were settler colonialists, and everyone knows that settler colonialists does not come to live peacefully that they've settled amongst. They have come to replace them. When we look at North Africa, we must look at the Arabs who have moved in for what they are, settler colonialists. Their goal is not to live peacefully, and they don't do that in any of those places. You look at the Sudan, at the peoples who choose to identify with their Arab heritage, they're acting every bit the part of settler colonialists. Look at the RDF in Sudan, which was originally the Janjaweed militia, which was slaughtering the Darfuris. The idea is they wanted to replace these people. That's what the United States did. Well, they didn't come to live peacefully with the indigenous peoples of the United States. They came to do to all of the indigenous peoples what they did successfully very early on to, say, the Mohicans on the eastern seaboard in the United States. They wiped them out. You have a question?
oftentimes, like within this text here, global political economy, words like expansion will be used. The author also does mention conquest and um, uh, invasion, right? But he opens up with expansion. And do you think that um, using more descriptive words to define these methods would be more beneficial to students other than saying expansion, because expansion sounds like a good thing? Or do you think we should, be more accurate to say like hegemony, world conquest, and domination? What are your thoughts on that?
But let's go back to intermediate algebra. In intermediate algebra, if you have a really good textbook, the beginning of the textbook is going to open up talking about definitions. Once it moves from the discussion on definitions, it's going to move into set theory. Sometimes it'll start with set theory, but it'll incorporate definitions within it. But what we're talking about here is definition. And what tends to happen is we hear a word like expansion, and it seems like it's a very benign word, but that's only because we have not given it a definition in terms of historical incidents. If we take that word expansion and define it in terms of historical incidents, then we're going to see exactly what's going on. But we're not even defining it in the classroom, and that's the fault of professors. The definition, the very idea that it needs to be defined, isn't put forth. And when I say it's the fault of professors, I'm understanding that we're talking about a system, which is basically a system, a factory style system or a diploma mill system, where, the actual goal is not education. It's simply a bit of training, not a lot, just a bit of training, because the idea is to prepare a few people to be functionaries in the existing system. So we don't even get into definitions. But if we did get into definitions, then we would have to take that word expansion and we look at Europeans who were in Europe. Why were the Europeans suddenly on the move out of Europe? There are a number of reasons, obviously. But let's start with the two peoples who began the European push. Because when the Portuguese and the Spanish start to moving out down into Africa, the only reason the rest of the Europeans weren't able to do that because they were too busy slaughtering. We're talking about the 1440s. 1400s in the United Kingdom, that's a bloody period. In France, that's a bloody period. They're slaughtering, they're fighting each other, they're trying, gain power and whatnot. The British, by the 1600s, they turn their eyes and they look at the Irish, and so they head over here and they deal with these people. So they're practicing or developing the system of globalization, of global political economy that we have today. They're really working out the kinks then. But if we look at the European peoples who start this push, what was the driving impetus for the Spanish and the Portuguese? Well, what had they just spent 800 years doing? They'd spent 800 years, for the most part, attempting to drive out the North African and West African Moors, drive them out of Spain. They'd been there since 780. They've been here since the 700s CE, and so we're talking about, say, down to it's 1492 when Granada falls. When Granada, quote unquote, for the Reconquista, when Granada is taken. Now, I'm saying that I'm going to say that a bit lightly when I say drive out the Moors, because the national hero of Spain, El Cid, when you look at the actual records in Spain, El Cid is a Moor, which is why he was called El Cid. He's the national hero of Spain for leading the Reconquista. When you really look at that history, you're going to see that you had Christian mercenaries fighting with the Muslims, you had Muslim mercenaries fighting with the Christians, and the battlefield was always fluid. But once the Portuguese, once the Spanish had seized control of the majority of the peninsula during the Reconquista, their push down into Africa was going directly into the lands that the peoples who had ruled over them for so many centuries were. That's pretty standard for a conquered people. Remember, we gave the example from Kemet, that once they had the National Liberation Movement had driven out the Hyksos, they didn't stop at the borders. They took their armies and they kept pushing on through, and it became standard imperial policy in Kemet. Every ruler of the kingdom, from Amhos and Amhos Nefertari, every ruler from those two, all of that husband and wife team, all the way down through the New Kingdom and on into the 19th dynasty, that was the foreign policy. That was the predominant foreign policy until the Bronze Age collapsed. Once the Bronze Age collapse happens, then things get, you see Kemet moving into the rate basically of a second tier power in terms of its actual formidability. But the long and extensive centuries millennia behind it still helped it to maintain its position. That, and more importantly for global political economy, something that I'm working on in the book I have, Kemet controlled the flow of gold in the ancient world at that time. It is only when the Persians sack Quaashie, conquer Kemet and whatnot, that they get their hands on the gold supplies that Kemet had maintained control of for centuries. For millennia. Now, Kemet didn't use gold as its means of facilitating economic transactions within the country, but it did use it to control other folks. You know, when Akhenaten is on the throne in Kemet, you see some of the governors in the cities over in Southwest Asia that Kemet was in control of were writing to him and say, look, we've got these nomads, they're roaming over us. You got to send me more gold so that I could do this and so that I could do that. You're seeing international political economy of that time. But anyway, using Kemet as that example, once they liberated themselves, they continued to push. So when we look at the Spanish and the Portuguese, yeah, in the book, in the textbooks, but then textbooks are your leading sources of propaganda, political propaganda, leading sources of economic propaganda. Textbooks are not, a textbook is not a neutral, it's not objective. There's nothing objective whatsoever. First off, objectivity isn't even objective. To say that for a person to say that they're objective is to make a value statement. So textbooks are going to call this area the age of the age of exploration. You know, and they say, well, it was expansion. But I mean, the expansion tells me a lot because you expanded into other people's land. So when we look at the Portuguese and we look at the Spanish and we're looking at the development of this global system, well, what are they doing? Their entire goal was, they wanted to break the Muslim monopoly on trade going back into the East. And one of the ways of doing that, they felt, having learned this from the mariners from Western Africa, was, to move down the coast around what they now call the Cape of Good Hope and come up. But you saw what they did all along the way. Establishment of colonies, disruption of kingdoms. You saw what they do. You saw what they did in Angola. You saw what they did in the Congo when they made their way up into the Congo. Disruption. They had 800 years of dealing with African people. They knew us very well. So they knew to bring those religious folks, the Catholic priests with them and send them in there because we're religious people. They took our strength and they made it, because the strength is always a weakness. So they took our strength and turned it into the weakness that it could be if you could manipulate it. So coming back to your question, when you use those terms like expansion, we have to go and define them. When in this text, when he does something where he says, what accounts for the racial hierarchies in countries such as the US and South Africa? Well, we have to address these things because there's nothing scientific about it. We cannot go anywhere in the world, anywhere on the planet, and find a nation where Black people are on top and whites are on the bottom. And if this stuff was statistically random, we should be able to go somewhere and find that. We can come to the African continent. We can go to the Caribbean with these Black nations. And we're going to see that as you move up the ladder, you start to either seeing lighter skin or whites either in positions of power or they're in the ears of the people in positions of power. None of our countries that we can call Black nations or African nations, none of those economies are controlled by the people of the nation, with the exception of Eritrea. I remember Eritrea is a pariah nation as far as the United States is concerned. They've got them under sanctions, economic sanctions and whatnot. Why? Because they choose to be self-reliant. They're choosing not to follow the Washington consensus. And so they're considered, no, don't be like them, which the American PR is pretty good on the continent because it's very shocking that you can go to so many different African countries and people in government, persons in academia, know little to nothing about Eritrea. Now, I say those people because when we get to talking about transnational power, which we won't get into today, but because we now have social media and all of these different forms of communication, you have people further down the hierarchy within our nations who are in contact with people in other countries as a result of all of these means of communication. And they are learning the history, say, of an Eritrea, for example, and they're making those connections at that level. So when we start to talking about this, expansion, when the Europeans expand, they take with them racial hierarchy, and they put this in place wherever they go. Wherever they go. So the current economy that's in place, when you look at how it was formed, is born out of bloodshed. For 400 years, from 1400 to 1800, there's bloodshed. There's a global European trade in enslaved Africans. Bloodshed, pain, destruction. Well, that's where this economy comes from. So they're saying European expansion. Why are Europeans expanding out of Europe? Because there's nothing there. The land was no good. And more importantly, I mentioned all of those wars that they fought with the peasant wars in Germany. Hell, the peasant wars in Germany, they wiped out 10 to 15 million people at the time of the wars, which was a very significant portion of the population. So they were constantly slaughtering themselves at that time. So by the time you move forward to when you start to seeing the English wanting to challenge the Spanish and the Portuguese in the global trade of enslaved Africans, the Dutch and all of these other peoples. Well, by this time, Europe is also population poor. The population numbers are not doing so well. And it shouldn't have been when you've had a variety of plagues that have struck the region. You've had constant, continuous war over all of that period, where you're supposed to have exactly the situation that we see when, what's his name? When Adam Smith is starting to write his book on the wealth of nations. because European nations were in need of figuring out a means of not when I say nations, I'm talking about the elites, because that's the other thing we have to understand about those nation states, those kingdoms in Europe at that time, was that this was strictly the elites of the nation. I mean, they treated their own population poor crappily. They exploited them to no end. So they simply they spread that system over the rest of the world. Okay, so now there's a section in chapter 3 where he looks at regions of the world economy. And he's talking about the areas of the world in the year 1400. There was little hint that the residents of Europe would have such an influence on the majority of people who lived in other regions. As the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French steadily moved outwards from their own continent, they encountered a variety of people and social organizations. Rather than expanding into a vacuum, the Europeans interacted with established civilizations, economic systems, and military forces, and destroyed them all. Now they keep using that term expanding because what we're talking about, they put in place settler colonies in many of these places. The two most successful settler colonies, New Zealand, they wiped out everybody. Australia, they weren't quite successful in doing it, although they tried very hard. The United States, they were fairly well successful in the genocide they committed against the indigenous peoples of the United States. So that expansion, this European quote unquote expansion, is conquest, settler colonialism, which is a very bloody enterprise. All right, so but 1400 to 1800, it's important that we look at that and see this is where that system is born from. And at its birth, it automatically engages in warfare with the peoples of the global South because it seeks to conquer and control. As I've said before, business economics is not some cooperative activity at the global level. Business and economics is not cooperative. A loan is not a cooperative endeavor. A grant is a cooperative endeavor. A loan is not cooperative. The economic system of the Europeans that is now being utilized by the rest of the peoples of Asia, because Europe is in Western Asia, even though it likes to think of itself as its own continent, that's still that same exact system. And economics is a system of warfare for a warlike people. It's not a cooperative endeavor. And so this system, that's what we have going on.
Can you repeat that one more time? You said economics is a war system.
Yes, economics for a warlike people is a war system, a system of warfare. It is not something where there's someone's going to come and help you. That has never been the case. The book we're going to get into later, Marxist Economic Theory by, I'm forgetting his name right now. But in that particular book, at the early part of the book, they're talking about the origins of trade. Trade doesn't begin with, that's not the beginnings of trade at the global scale. The beginnings of trade at the global scale begins with brigandage, outlaw, pillaging, destruction. That's what it has to be for a warlike people. Can create a system of economics where it's cooperative. But there is nothing cooperative and has ever been cooperative about European society since the collapse of the matriarchal societies going all the way back in Europe along the Danube River, going back to, I think it's 3900 BC or whatever. I'm forgetting the year right off the top of my head. But when the nomads out of the Russian steppes moved down and clashed with the matriarchal societies that were settled along the Danube and other rivers in Europe, they spent 3,000 years at war with one another. And for those who would want to go and read further on this in detail, Cheikh Anta Diop mentions it in his book, Civilization or Barbarism. And he also cites the author who studies that he was reading and looking at. But you have to go all the way back there before you find a cooperative society in Europe. This stuff that they have now is not cooperative. As you look back at their history, they have certain institutions, cooperative institutions that maintain themselves up until the Industrial Revolution. You know, when they started to closing off, they had the enclosure movement so that they could force people off the land and from supporting themselves and force them to get jobs in factories. But they're warlike people, and the warlike people don't engage in cooperative economics whatsoever. And there's nothing about the economic system that hasn't been changed. We didn't change it. When you start to looking at 1956, when the Sudan gains its independence on the African country, then you look at the independence of Ghana, and you move and look at all of the rest of the countries, the economic system, for the most part, was not changed. You had a few cases where there were efforts to change it, and the Europeans moved very quickly to nip that by sending in jackals and buying off local. Well, they didn't have to buy them off because they had trained many of the militaries and the police forces. So they just, pushed them forward, say, okay, we need you to do that. But yes, economics as it stands in the world today is a system of warfare. It is not a system of cooperative economics. The BRICS movement is an effort to move towards a more cooperative system, but it is not itself a cooperative system. It is still based upon loans. It is still, and loans is what I'm trying to say. It's not a cooperative, a grant, because there's no strings attached with a grant. Yes, so if I'm trying to help you cooperatively, I'm going to provide you with a grant and things of that nature. But yes, it's definitely a system. Economics as it is now is a system of warfare coming from a warlike people who have done nothing in their history but spread war across the globe. They are continuing to do this. We have so much information that's put out here now, we can see these things. You can't walk in the halls of power in any African nation, for the most part, any Caribbean nation, without seeing the faces of those people that are undermining the economic foundations of that nation. They are undermining the foundation of the nation. And the book Economic Hitmen, it calls them the jackals. That's their job. But those aren't the only jackals. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, in their own way, are undermining the foundations of the nations of Africa and the Caribbean, when we're dealing with Black people specifically. The undermining the foundations of the nations in South Asia that are constantly being labeled as being impoverished or poor or corrupt, and a host of other terms that they toss out there. Because economics is warfare. Economics is about hegemony when these people are practicing. It's not cooperative. There's nothing cooperative whatsoever. None whatsoever. Okay, so now when we move into the next period of next period in the history of the current economic system, we are now looking at 1800 to 1945. And what do we have? Industry, empire, and war. By 1800, the powers of Europe are fully focused on acquiring and acquiring, if they didn't already have it, or maintaining their empire, their colonies. And then you also have them developing, you have the Industrial Revolution taking place, and these countries seeking ways to improve their positioning through that. And then you also have war. 1800 through 1945, you have constant wars going place, whether it's wars taking place between the different powers deciding who was going to rule, the Napoleonic Wars, for example, in Europe, or you are looking at the wars that the Europeans are waging in India to maintain their power, and the fact that the wars that they begin to become engaged in other parts of the world, specifically for that purpose. They want to maintain that empire. They want to maintain their global economic position. At no point from 1800 to 1945, when Europe is in control of, say, India, for example, were they doing anything to develop India? They destroyed India and turned it into the mess into a giant mess from which they were extracting wealth and sending back to the UK. When you get to, quote unquote, the two wars, the war from 1914 and 1918, and then the war from 1939 to 1945, with the Europeans, that's a struggle to determine who's going to control that global empire that's out there. The French had their colonial empire. The British had their colonial empire. The Spanish and the Portuguese were trying to hold on to the last remnants of their colonial empire, which had at one point been massive and global. But now, they were on their last legs by that point. But once again, this 1800, 1945, this is not a period of cooperative economics. This is not a period where this is economics. Economics is a bloody affair and has been for quite some time. And then all we see in 1945, when you begin to start to looking at the independence movements starting in Asia and then moving over into Africa, all you're really seeing is a renewed imperialism. They're simply renewing it. They never got rid of it. Empire never went away. This was simply a means of them reshaping it. They'll say, okay, we're going to have to make some changes. We're not going to be able to do things the way we were doing it, say from 1800 to all the way up to 1945. So we're going to have to make some changes, which they did. I mean, look at what happened in the 1900s in Europe when we talk about this economic system, the liberal market system. The Europeans destroyed hundreds of thousands of their own citizens' lives. They herded people in the cities. It was hyper-urbanization, forced people to work in factories. Vulnerable women and children were the initial factory labor force until a free labor market eventually dragged in male workers. In the international arena, the wealth generated by the British textile industry relied on US slave labor to produce the input of raw cotton. Progress, that's what they're calling progress, had its costs, and they were distributed very unevenly. So this is not some benign, wonderfully operating system of global political economy. It's a bloody and exploitative, a predatory system, and still is. Still is. Doesn't matter which of the European nations is in charge of it, it is going to always be that way. That is the nature of that system. It is not a cooperative system. It's competitive, it's conflict-oriented. I'm not working with you. My goal is to destroy you. You can sit up and have all of the diplomatic niceties that you want, but that's the goal. The interests of the settler colony nations in New Zealand and Australia, all of their interests are diametrically opposed to the interests of the nations in which they are engaged with providing foreign direct investment. Those interests are not the same, which is why they keep the countries, as best as possible, a basket case, which is why they have watered down, quote unquote, leftist politics, because you don't want a radical politics that's going to flip or overthrow the system and destroy their base of power. That's not what you want. So, you're going to keep getting these programs where you take the best and the brightest from the African continent and take them to Washington, D.C., and let them meet senators and let them meet members of the presidential cabinet and wine them and dine them and show them the trappings of power in Washington, D.C., that many of the residents of Washington, D.C. never get to see. And show them all of that and whisper all these sweet nothings in their ear and then send them back to the continent. And they've got all these images in their head and they come back over here and they want to replicate that system because you've also filled them to no end with a bunch of crap that you get at Harvard and at Yale and at Stanford and at any other university in the US, PWI or HBCU. But you put all of this foolishness, all of this destructiveness in their heads, you send them back over here, they start trying to replicate it, and you maintain the European in their position of power. There's no such thing as free trade. That's what when we look at the history, so we start looking at the history of the global economic system, you see there's no such thing as free trade. There never has been. In the 1800s, a book was written. At the time a book was written, it's called The National System. At the time that the book was written, Germany was definitely not unified. You had all of these different, different kingdoms, principalities, a big mess. So you had a writer, Frederick List. He wrote the book National System of Political Economy. And he wrote it in German. The purpose of the book, written in 1856, what he was showing was that if Germany wanted to be able to compete or wanted to elevate its position in Europe and in the world, it was going to have to move away from, quote unquote, a free trade system because it doesn't work. What the UK was calling free trade at the time was not free trade. And that's what he was pointing out in his massive book. And he's going back in history and he's showing, he looks at the US example and he's explaining in detail. But there's no such thing as free trade. There never has been free trade. All of these, the American economy, those companies are subsidized. When they're in farming, they're subsidized by the government. You've got government support. All of this protecting them from goods made outside of the country. But it's over here on the continent which is where you find capitalism, because you don't find capitalism in reality in the Western nations. You actually find it in the global South. It's in the global South that you actually get these laws put in place for free trade and all of the other institutions and principles of capitalism. The government would be overthrown in the United States if they tried to actually do that in its raw form. If you tried to actually do that in France in its raw form, in the UK in its raw form, the government would be overthrown by the people. So in reality, in the West, they don't really have it's not really capitalism. It's some kind of a mixed system in many cases. But here in the global South, it's capitalism. It's wide open, free trade and capitalism. So you can walk through the docks of Ghana and you can look at the markets and you can see crap from all over the world. And you can see all of this crap that could be made in Ghana that is destroying the economy here. And all of this is an outgrowth of what was solidified from 1800 to 1945, and then bringing us then into the current period where you now have, quote unquote, globalization and the global economy. Because what do we have? From 45 to 89, you had the Cold War. But then you go and you look from 1990 to the present, you've got globalization, which is basically simply the old global political system, just giving it a new name. You dress it up. And now you don't have European governors over neo-colonies. You got Black colonialists over neo-colonies in the Caribbean, over the neo-colonies on the African continent. And these people are managing the system, managing these colonies, continuing them on the path of wealth extraction, growing these one or two goods for the global economy to be selling around the world, pushing entrepreneurship, pushing this talk, not simply telling the youth to become involved in agriculture, but telling them to become involved in agribusiness, growing foods not for the local market, not to feed the local village, not to feed the local region, the regions, or to feed the nation itself, not to make the nation food self-sufficient, not to make the nation a food sovereign, but no, grow it so you can sell it on the global market. That's what we're calling, that's that globalization foolishness that we now have. So, and what are we having? When we look at these nations, they're all doing the exact same thing. Every few years, they're running back to the International Monetary Fund so they can get money that allows them to service the debt that has already been accumulated. So the IMF is simply, okay, I'm going to give you this money. Then you got commercial banks in the West. We're going to give you this money so that you can use this money to purchase these goods from us, and also use this money from the IMF, to pay the interest on your loan, service the debt, and a host of other foolishness. But the idea of looking at the system in its origins and how it has grown is so that we can then localize ourselves properly in this system. Properly. And that's not what happened at the universities. I don't care if it's the best university in Ghana. I don't care if it's the best university in the Republic of South Africa. That's not what's happening. You're turning out functional illiterates who are economically ignorant. And I'm saying they're economically ignorant because they're talking about an economics of liberation sometimes, but they are pursuing and utilizing institutions which are imperialist economic institutions and can only further tighten the chains of the enslavement that we find ourselves under economically and politically. So any questions?
And tell me how important this is or not. But as we're going through these developments from 1400s to the 1950s, 60s, how important is it to note or understand that these are not just governments in play, but there are also individuals and corporations that are the main benefactors to this so-called expansion and development of capitalism?
Yeah, look at the British East India Company. Look at the British East India Company, the original corporate raiders, the original multinational corporation. So when we start to look and say, okay, well, we want these multinationals to come and invest over here, foreign direct investment, help us out, yada, yada, yada. That's not the purpose of that corporation. That's never been the purpose of multinational corporations. The British East India Company's purpose was to extract the wealth from India and send it back to the UK. When you look at the different corporations that are operating on the African continent, even if they have some percentage that's owned by the governments, these corporations have their origins in the colonial system, and their purpose was wealth extraction, and that's what they continue to do. Look at the Ghana and Mali. They don't control their own gold supply. You're pulling all of this gold out of the ground, but you don't have gold reserves in your own country. Your gold reserves are in the UK. They're in France. If the gold reserves are somewhere else, they're not yours. So when we look at these corporations, these multinational corporations are the key actors in this system. When we talk about international business, we talk about international trade, you are basically talking about multinational corporations that are coming from the what's called the triad, coming from the United States and Europe and those places. It's coming from Japan. It's coming from China. Most of global trade is in the hands of corporations from that region, not from the African continent. No. But we have our students sitting in classes studying international trade, studying international business. You're basically studying 25, 30, 40, 50 companies from the West You're studying companies operating out of China. You're studying companies operating out of Japan, the Republic of South Korea, Singapore. That's what we're looking at. That's what we're talking about here. Not from the African continent. And those corporations don't exist to help any nation, quote unquote, develop. And we really should be getting in, there really should be a discussion on what's meant when they say economic development. What do they mean by development? Because if you've been conquered in a war, if you've been conquered, if you're being dominated, you need reconstruction. You need to rebuild everything. And we're talking about right down to the cognitive institutions that you carry around in your mind. But no, these multinational corporations, no.
Yeah, I learned about this after the last Gulf War, was it Desert Storm? Where it was brought to light that Halliburton, was it Halliburton?
Yeah, Halliburton. Yeah.
And the relationship between these multinational corporations, and their relationship and their interconnectedness in the government of the United States with these different projects in the Middle East. And it became like very clear. It was crystal clear for anybody that paid attention to it that, this isn't about national security. This is about corporate greed and, again, invasion and expansion of capitalism. And I don't know like how many other obvious instances we can point to throughout history, but that time period made me really look at global political economy and begin to understand that nothing is what we're being told it is in relation to any of this stuff.
Not at all. And we don't even know, we're not taught. I won't say we don't know. We're not even taught to attempt to seek out, or we're not even taught to really ask the questions that are necessary, that'll help us to get to an understanding of it. And that's because we're in survival mode. If we're in the United States, if we're in Europe, if we're on the African continent, if we're in the Caribbean, if we're in Oceania, wherever we are in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, everything is focused on where's my next meal coming from, in a system where we now pay for a place to stay, we're paying for food, we are paying for clothing. We're focused on survival, and we're doing all of this, and we're living paycheck to paycheck. It's survival. And that's if you have a paycheck. And if you're not, you're out hustling, you're trying to come up with all kind of ways to do this. So you don't even have the ability. We don't even have the ability for most people to even attempt to try to ask the question that could get us to a proper understanding, comprehension, proper perspective on what's actually going on, or on what's really taking place. Which, survival, a species must survive, yes, but there has to be more than survival. It can bring us back to that word expansion. You're supposed to survive, thrive, and expand. But we're just stuck strictly in the surviving mode and the things that we have to do to survive. And we dislike a lot of what we have to do to survive. So what we end up doing is we start to taking in different drugs to help us numb the pain of survival, whether it's narcotics, alcohol, or any other narcotics, whether it's religion, whether it's sex. We've got so many different things that we turn to to help us, to help us to forget. So yes, multinational corporations, like now what we have during the Gulf War, it was during the second Gulf War, it was during the first Gulf War, second Gulf War, it was Halliburton. I guess Halliburton was in both of them though, even if it had changed its name. What do you have now? What, BlackRock? I think it's BlackRock or something. But that's the name of the game. And that's not, those aren't just new. Those aren't something new that's never been seen before. It's just the latest incarnation of the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. I don't recall the actual name for the French variant, but it was there. The United States and the companies, what was it? The United Fruit Company that went down into Central America, South America. The corporations from the US that went into the Philippines. It's the same playbook. It's the same playbook. They've adapted it in the sense of you have more, quote unquote, of the natives taking a part. But there was a book written, the title of it was Who Rules? And so what we have is in the book Who Rules, they talk about who is actually ruling. And in the one of the later editions of the book done in the early 2000s, they showed how now the ruling group consisted not only of white men, but they had representative white women, they had those faces in there, they had black women they brought in, they had blacks, they were very inclusive. They started bringing in Indians, Indian immigrants. They brought in the gays. And so now, 2023, they're also including the LGBTQIA plus with the transgender, but you're being inclusive, putting some of these faces in here. Now, these faces accept all of the social and cultural institutions there, to be accepted into that, but become a part of that ruling group. So in terms of the multinational corporations, these corporations and operations around the world, they've adjusted, because you can't just be blatant as it was, say, with the East India Company. But now, you, as Amos Wilson put it, you just have white power in blackface. All right. So do you have any questions or any comments?
No, I think you covered just about everything. I asked the questions that I did have. The most important thing that came out of this was that last question that I asked, because the text, both texts did, the introduction to international political economy and also global political economy, both of them talk pretty much about the development of these nations and the interrelationship between these nations and globalization. And my only questions was, which I asked was, I guess a primary question was, will we look at the relationships that these corporations and prior to corporations, you had private families, you had monarchs that were really leading the charge into this so-called expansion. And I just wanted to know how important that was, and if we'll actually get into that as we go forward. It may not be important, toward understanding how this all relates to us as African people. But I think that question kind of looms, because of some of the studies that I've done on, things like corporate conspiracy and international conspiracies and things of that nature. So I just want to make sure that I don't get off track, following different ideas that really aren't beneficial to us in this study.
Well, yes, definitely the questions you ask are definitely a key part of it, because it provides us with, even if it doesn't specifically deal with us, it's merely a case of, if it doesn't, it just hasn't reached that point with us yet in terms of global political economy. But it's providing examples and lessons that we can learn from, if it hasn't been a part, even if it hasn't been a part of our own experience as a people within the system. And it's important just because it's a question that's on your mind, which means it's a question that is going to lead you further on that the quest that you're taking in terms of opening up this information. So we'll definitely be seeing as we get further into the information, we're going to be seeing those case studies, those examples, and what we can draw from it in terms of our utilization of this information to engage in the proper type of behavior and actions that we need to engage in to accomplish the tasks that we say we want to accomplish. Oh, I was gonna say, as far as laying a bit of the historical foundation or the historical background for everything, definitely, because I think that's very important. Because when we look at that and it brings us to the present, and then we stuck in on the end, it's like looking at the countries now. Ghana's going to the IMF, so we've connected that whole history, and it helps us to localize ourselves and to really understand what's going on. And that's why I felt those chapters were very important, because we can always add in stuff as we move forward, talking about soft power and hard power, and looking more in detail at the different institutions in global political economy. But that historical foundation and the connections that we make along the way from different things, definitely. So that's really what I wanted to deal with, and definitely looking at it in terms of a different value system.
Having the ability to have this dialogue, this interchange, helps to give clarity. Because if I was to just read through it on my own, probably wouldn't be able to develop the right questions and get those answers as you mentioned. So I appreciate it.
All right. It's always good, because it makes it clear on both ends. Everything is that reciprocal relationship. So it's like it's back and forth. Certain questions cause me to see things or to think about things in a certain way, or to bring things into the subject that I may not have initially thought about. So it's constant, that constant interaction, which helps us all.
Absolutely.